Good afternoon and welcome to week 10, day 1 of History and Systems of Psychology. We're rounding the corner on the semester, right? So I hope that you enjoyed your break and got your much needed sleep that we talked about needing as a class, it sounded like. First thing I want to mention is we will not have class on Thursday. I'm traveling to a conference in Little Rock, Arkansas, so class will be canceled that day. I will have an activity for you to do, and that will be posted to announcements. So any questions about that? All right, let's go ahead and get started. Due to the fact that I'm not going to be here on Thursday, I'm going to be showing you several videos, and these are videos that I would have shown in class on Thursday were I to be there. So I want to start by talking about G. Stanley Hall. And right now, without notes, without your textbook or computer, I want you to take a few minutes to jot down what you remember about G. Stanley Hall, because I know it's been a while since we've talked about him. And that's where our content for exam 3 will start. Have a good break. Get to spend time with your daughter. That's nice. Right, it looks like everyone's had a chance to jot down one or maybe a couple of things. I've broken the board down into 2 factions, as it were. Major items, so I would say lasting legacies of G. Stanley Hall's practice, as well as more accessory items, which could be a bit more trivial in nature, but I like the fact that this book does paint a picture of the person as a whole, and sometimes that's a way to start getting you interested in someone, right? So to see this person as a man and the social environment in which he grew up and spent his adult life. So let's start with more major items related to G. Stanley Hall. legacies.
Who's the first person to get a PhD in psychology?
And if he did nothing else, that's still pretty important, right? Okay, let's keep going.
He kind of created the stage between childhood and adulthood with adolescence.
He did, yeah. We'll say bridge the gap between childhood and adulthood, coining it adolescence. And do you remember what he characterized adolescence as? It was a period of blank and blank. Not ringing a bell?
Storm and stress.
Yes, period of storm and stress, very good. All in all, doesn't sound pleasant for anyone who is an adolescent or involved with an adolescent or having to spend lots of time with an adolescent. Storm and stress, and we'll come back to that in just a moment. Okay, good. Others?
He grew up on a farm.
Okay, should we put that on an accessory item?
Yes.
Okay. That's interesting, right? Okay, others?
He's one of the founders of the APA, the American Psychology Association.
Yeah, and that's nothing to sneeze at, okay? So one of the founders of APA.
Wasn't he the first president of APA too?
I want to say that he is, but I can't say that 100% right now.
I read something about that. But
Okay, we'll take it.
Yeah, don't take my word at a grain of salt.
Okay, and one of the early presidents for sure.
Yeah.
If not the first. Okay. We have not exhausted the list of his accomplishments.
Did he go to med school at Harvard?
I believe that he did, yeah.
I wrote down Harvard with a question mark,
Harvard,
so I just
yeah.
wanted to make sure.
He was involved at Harvard, he taught at Harvard.
Okay.
Yeah, and he supervised PhD students, several of whom we'll be talking about later. Okay, so we're missing a few key components of who he was. When you think of educational psychology and developmental psychology, G. Stanley Hall should be there. So there was definitely a strong education component. Remember, he wrote a book that was for teachers that discussed what was going on in children's lives and based on that information, how you might go about educating them. So that was a legacy, an enduring legacy of his, the importance of developmental psychology, right? We should not treat them like they're young adults. And other things, maybe that piqued your brain, something that was going on up here in your brain.
One thing that was going on in my brain, but I don't know. If
Yes.
right, did he create the first psychology laboratory? Like something along the lines of that?
Yeah, so there were, a lot of these people created laboratories that were like the first of their kind. Yeah. Any other substantive item? No? Okay. Let's look in the book for a couple of minutes, all right? If you look on page 298, I will say, like, in terms of a laboratory of this kind, it was the first of its kind that dealt with child studies. Okay, so if you look on page 298, it says, as American psychology's most important founder, Hall resembled Wundt more than James. In his research, however, he clearly belonged in the functional and practical American tradition pioneered by James. So if I were to ask you to compare Wundt and Hall, you could say, like, Wundt was experimental psychology, right, and sort of lived in that lab setting. Hall had a lab setting where he could observe children, he could do experiments and things, but one of his legacies was that he wanted to take that stuff and find a way to make it applicable to society. So in that extent, when we talk about research being theoretical or applied, he was not just looking at research staying in these very high-end journals, but doing something. We're going to do something good. We're going to help children, the education of children specifically through the work, okay? Remember, he conducted studies on children, questionnaires on children, which I can only imagine that would be, you would need patience. Let's just put it that way. At the top of page 299, it says, in the early 1800s, he began a large series of questionnaire studies of kindergarten-aged children, designed to find out what they knew and thought about a great variety of things. Their bodies, that could be a tricky one, right? Games and stories, animals, the sun and the stars, cosmology comes back into play again, and religion. And we talked about the fact that he published his findings in a work entitled The Contents of Children's Minds on Entering School, and that had the partly practical goal of assisting teachers when they came into the classroom. And first year teachers are just like, that's a hard life for anyone, that first year of teaching, if you know someone who's been a teacher. So definitely any supplemental materials that they can be given is helpful, although a lot of the learning does take place on the spot. Okay, his book on adolescence was darker in its title. It says the title was Adolescence, Its Psychology, and Its Relation to Physiology, Anthropology, Sociology, Sex, Crime, Religion, and Education. Wow, that's a lot to say you've tackled in one book, right? So healthy ego for sure with G. Stanley Hall.
All right. What did he think about the education of men and women? This will go into an accessory item, or maybe
kind of between these two.
Didn't he think women shouldn't be educated because they'd be infertile if they were?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we'll get to that quote that really encompasses that in just a moment. That's a really nice way of putting it. Okay. So didn't want them to be infertile, right? They're responsible for populating the world, right, in his eyes. What else? What other reasons? Did he believe that I'm a female, that we had the same capacity for learning? Not quite. At the top of page 300, it says, Hall recommended that educators encourage and support boys, especially white boys, to systematically relieve all the racial strains of their diverse ethnic heritage in order to reach the highest stage of evolution. So these white boys were the ones that could reach the highest stages of evolution. Non-white males and females, and certainly females, he didn't feel we could get to that top stage. And there are elements of eugenics in this statement. It says this necessitated a prolonged adolescence in which boys would express their savage origins and pass through them, eventually creating a race of supermen. Sounds very eugenic-y, right? And not in a good way. Who would
reach their full evolutionary potential. All right, with other races, well, their evolutionary past didn't seem stellar based on how it was presented. So of course, based on that, Hall felt they would have limited ability to succeed at this high level education-wise. Okay, and I love this quote for how it really encapsulates his feelings about women. And not only his feelings, but other feelings. On page 300, it says, it was widely believed that prolonging the education of young women during puberty could damage their reproductive organs by diverting blood from their reproductive systems to the brain, all right? Very scientific, right? No. Hall thus advocated a different, less intellectually strenuous education for women. His views are not, or I hope would not be well accepted today, but back in the day, those were the views held by most people. What's interesting is that in lieu of these views, he educated Calkins, who went on to complete all the requirements for a PhD at Harvard. She was, during her lifetime, unable to receive this award, right? And he educated an African American who became a psychologist, right? So, and also was influential in the work of an African American couple who became psychologists. So for all of his talk, it's interesting how he acted in, and maybe he saw these as unique situations, like not the norm, was very different from that. So I find that interesting. Okay. And around this time, Freud is happening, right? Freud and his ideas are becoming well known. So both he and G. Stanley Hall talked about the influence of sex. You know, in his book, he talks about that. And Freud talks about it too, but in very different ways and in terms of how that relates to development. So I just wanted to make sure you understood that that was also going on during this time frame. Okay, if you want to follow along, we're on page 301. And we are talking about Francis Cecil Sumner. He was born in 1895 and passed away in 1954. He was the first African American to receive a PhD in psychology. So we have lots of firsts going on. He was the last PhD student that Hall supervised. And his dissertation was Psychoanalysis of Freud and Adler. I haven't looked at the dissertation, but it should be available somewhere to look at online if you'd like to take a peek at that. He became head of psychology at Howard University, so head of the psychology department, and that was an all African American university. And so when you're working on your PhD, you have a certain amount of leeway and a certain amount of freedom on what you study. But to a certain extent, what you study will be influenced by the person who is supervising you, okay? So once he got past the PhD realm and was on his own established as a psychologist, he became interested in psychology of religion. And so some of the items related to that, he attended the First International Congress for Religious Psychology, where he presented a paper on mental hygiene and religion, and that helped him establish connections with many leading European psychologists. He taught courses on the subject during the 1940s and prepared a massive manuscript entitled The Structure of Religion, A History of European Psychology of Religion. Who else have we talked about recently that was involved in religion and interested in religion and spirituality?
He's one of my favorites.
James.
Yeah, it was James. Okay, so this was something that was coming into the minds and how religion works from a psychological perspective, right? And how it is set up. So I'm sure that would be a very interesting manuscript to read. Okay, we're going to watch a short video about Sumner.
Welcome to the channel. My name is Matt Lawson. I'm a therapist with Chicago Compass Counseling, and in honor of Black History Month, I will be profiling Francis Cecil Sumner, the father of Black psychology. Francis Sumner was born in 1895 during a time when educational opportunity for Black people just was not there. If you think about the time that he grew up, he was only a couple generations away from slavery. And was already really achieving academically at a very young age. He went on to attend Lincoln University, where he graduated summa cum laude with honors and was the valedictorian of his class. He went on to earn a second bachelor's degree from Clark University. And shortly after earning that degree, he would go on to apply for a doctorate program. Sumner was accepted into the program, but unfortunately World War I started, and he was drafted into the war and went off to Germany to fight in a battalion. Upon returning from the war, Sumner picked right back up where he left off and reapplied for the PhD program, which he was accepted back into. He would graduate with that program by successfully defending his dissertation on the psychoanalysis of Freud and Adler. From there, he would teach at multiple historical black colleges and is even credited with being a founding member of the psychology department at Howard University. Sumner was a staunch advocate for education in the black communities. One of the bigger areas that he really focused on was debunking a lot of the theoretical bias that was created, racist bias that was created around the lack of intelligence that black people possess, especially compared to white people. So a lot of the work that he did was really about showing that that just wasn't true. He was a pioneer during his time, both in psychology and in education, and really laid that foundation for black people to shoot for something higher when it came for their academic pursuits. All right, thanks for watching this video. Another nice short one. Please, if you would like to find out more about me and our
So I thought you would find that interesting, and it gives you just a bit of information on what was going on around that time period and why his accomplishments are so important to mention. So that you can refer to in the PowerPoint. Okay, we're going to turn now to Mamie and Kenneth. I've combined the first and last name, Kenneth Clark. How about that? Born in 1917 and 1914, respectively. Up to that time, they were the most famous African-American couple in psychology's history. They conducted a number of famous studies on racial identity in black and white children. And this was the first time, the case of Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka was the first case that took in actual psychology research as something that was helpful as a determining factor for that case, okay? And specifically, they drew on the work of these two individuals and the doll test and desegregation. So what we're gonna listen to now is just a very short clip talking about that very important experiment, or study, excuse me. I think this is the one.
Dolls. They are every young girl's companion and friend. But dolls can represent much more in a youngster's life. In 1939, psychologist Dr. Kenneth Clark and his wife, the late Mamie Phipps Clark, used dolls to gauge ego and self-esteem in young black children. After asking the children questions about white and black dolls, the results shocked both the Clarks and the nation.
We found that black children knew that they were different, that they had lower status. They internalized in the development of their own self-image these negative stereotypes of the society, and the majority, 2 out of 3 of the children, rejected the brown dolls as being negative and bad, etc.
Here, Sir Jane, you can have Nancy. It's a present. Mommy just got it for me. I want that one. Frida's my friend. I've had her all my life. Mommy! Mommy! Yes? She took my doll.
Sarah Jane, where are your manners? Now give it back.
I don't want the black one.
The disturbing thing was when we asked them, show me the doll that's most like you, they then had to identify with a doll that they had rejected and had a deep sense of their own inadequacy and inferiority at that time.
The findings of that study were dramatic enough to catch the attention of the United States Supreme Court. Their 1954 ruling striking down the separate but equal doctrine and ordering school desegregation was influenced by the Clark's so-called doll study.
We did not do the study for the court. We did the study as psychologists. But the lawyers of the NAACP, when they read our reports and studies, said that they thought it was quite relevant to the case of segregation and the effects of segregation on personality.
Since the 54 decision, America has inched begrudgingly slow toward the implementation of desegregation orders. The first battlegrounds were the South, places like Little Rock, the University of Alabama, and Mississippi. Later, the struggle moved north to places like Boston. Clark blames lack of self-esteem for many of the problems in the schools today, from high dropout rates to violence.
It will take more than laws. It will take more than court decisions. Obviously, churches haven't been particularly effective at helping people to be more humane in their relationship with their fellow human beings. And my feeling is that we will need a wide and deep approach to educating in our children, not to be hostile and inhumane.
To those who say desegregation didn't work and that we were probably better off in segregated schools, how do you respond?
Desegregation doesn't work because we haven't tried it. We haven't really reorganized our schools away from racial lines. You know, we haven't used our schools and educational institutions as a way of educating human beings to work and to respect others.
What relevance do you see to the doll study today?
Well, what I see now is that we have to help white children as well as black children to develop a positive, healthy sense of their own being, the self-respect. Racism, as I see it, is indicative of a lack of self-respect among all the groups. You don't hate other human beings if you have a positive sense of your own being. Have those dolls there as the beginning of communicating a sense of humanity and decency. I found, by the way, that in our studies, we did have some children who had parents or other adults who helped them in this, and they did not reject the brown doll. It can be done. You can teach children to respect themselves as a basis for respecting their fellow human beings.
Okay. Want to just underscore this note. This was the first Supreme Court case in the United States history to use social science data in its deliberations. So it was important for a number of reasons, but that's something that's sometimes not mentioned about it that I think is very relevant and important for us to know. Since then, so many cases have been informed by social science research, right? If you have an opportunity, I'd like for you to take a look at this video. And what it does is it talks about, you know, how far have we come since the Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka in the last 70 years. So, and I'd be happy if you would like some extra credit. I'll give you some instructions on a write-up that you could do on that. But I think it's really relevant, and I'd love to say that the study would no longer hold up. I don't know to what extent it would today. So just lots of maybe sobering thoughts to consider. And this also, like the other one, is embedded in the PowerPoint, so it's easy for you to access. All right, we are moving to Mary Whiten Calkins. She was the oldest child of a Presbyterian minister. And I'm going to bounce down to here. She grew up in an intellectually stimulating environment. So the parents really encouraged learning, lots of books around the value of education for boys and girls was touted by the parents. So you have that on the one hand, and that sounds really great. And it sounds like, yeah, that's a good breeding ground for someone to come out and, be potentially this great person in psychology. But there was also another darker side of Calkins' life. She grew up in New York and at 17 moved with her family to Newton, Massachusetts. During the time she was in New York, her mom suffered mental and physical collapse. And what does that remind you of? You've heard this before, right? With William James's father and James himself. And what was that collapse called? Starts with a V. Vastations. Excellent, excellent, okay? So mom was suffering badly to the point that Calkins pursued her education at a high level and took care of the family herself. She never left the family home and she never married. She studied at Smith College, and upon graduation, she was offered and accepted a position in the Greek department of Wellesley College, which was also an all-women's college. Okay, on page 302, at the bottom, if you like to follow along, it says, well, she accepted the position. That's not like Greek was what she wanted to do for the rest of her life, right? But it was a way to get her foot in the door. After just 1 year of teaching Greek, she was considered for the job of introducing experimental psychology into Wellesley's curriculum. So the psychology of Wundt into this curriculum. Her only qualification was an interest in the subject matter. The one psychology course she'd taken and enjoyed at Smith College had been in the philosophical speculative tradition. Okay, so they want her to do this, but we need you to have at least some qualifications beyond teaching Greek, which is nice, but doesn't say much about your ability to understand or teach psychology. It says no better qualified candidate appeared, so in 1890, Calkins was offered an instructorship in psychology contingent on her completing a year of advanced study in that field. So the question was then, okay, I need a year of advanced study. That sounds like a really great deal, but where, as a woman, am I going to go to get this advanced study? Harvard and Clark University would have been top choices, but none admitted women. The number of graduate schools in the entire world that admitted women were very low and inconveniently located for Calkins, okay, because she lived in the Boston area and was still taking care of mom and of siblings. She impressed someone by the name of Josiah Royce, who recommended that she attend regular seminars, even though that was not at all the norm to allow women to attend regular seminars. And then James was teaching at Harvard, and he also said, she's really good, let's have her in there. So William James was also influential in her education. Early on, she proved to be a pupil who could teach her teacher. What does that mean, a pupil who could teach her teacher?
It just sounds like she's a student who may know more than what her teacher could offer to teach her. She didn't bring 1%.
Yeah. So early on, you could see those. We talked about pedagogy, right? Meaning study of teaching. She had those pedagogical skills, and she also was constantly seeking to improve her knowledge base. And those two items made her someone who excelled and was at the top of her class, so to speak, wherever she went. She got expert but unofficial advice from Edmund Sanford on how to equip a psychological laboratory. They let her have a lab, and she originated something called the paired associates technique. And I want you to take a few minutes and look this up, and you're going to tell me a little bit about it. So I will write it on the board. You want to look for a reputable source, Calkins, paired associates technique.
Okay, what I'd like for you to do now is let's get into 3 groups. two groups of three and one dynamic duo, as it were, and talk about your findings, and then you can report back to the class. Thank you.
I'm also assuming we're on the same website, learningstatistics.org. Or sign, yeah, I just can't read, sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, I just talked about how she was
It's like a numbers. Then I also kept reading down to modality effects. I can't.
I found that it's basically like when you're learning
Effects,
new
recency.
word, and it's like pairing that word with.
I was reading through all of those and like all
So
the
like
different
color
effects
blue
of like
for, like,
recency and stuff.
stuff like that.
But so she just kind of doing some testing on how fast and how well people can remember based on like certain events happening while you're
so
learning.
so just like numbers and colors. You'd like show the color and ask what number it was paired with.
Yeah, like
So say
the,
what.
yeah. The example that my class I gave was the calendar was the stimulus and the shoe was the response. So when somebody said the word calendar, it would be
Oh yeah.
shoe. I thought that was a really bad example because like when I think of a calendar, I think of like, you know, the picture that's with the calendar or the dates or, you know, the holiday in the month or whatever, because it's always.
Something else is just some random website where it's like
I don't know, that
they
was
do, she also did association where it's like when you think of one animal, you think of
I think
another
it's
thing.
pretty
Like when you say
interesting,
dog, you also think
I
of
always
cat
try to do
because
that
they're
in my
just
own
like
head, like when I think of things, like when I'm studying or whatever, but I didn't know there was like a term for it, so that makes it a lot easier to like, I don't know, study. I guess.
reversed. So if I tell people to see if
I also talked about a little bit how her lab was actually. I don't know if it was strong, but she just worked on it.
I also found that like when people
she's also the first female president of the American
two
Association.
separate responses, so like one response would be to focus on like the stimulus of like what the person presented you with, but then the other side would be you're trying to figure out how to respond to that stimulus. So it's like two different thinking.
More about this.
Okay, I'd like to hear from this group first. What did you learn?
We kind of talked about how it was like the association between stimuli and responses,
Okay.
and how it kind of forces you to think in two different ways. Like, the first way would be like learning what your stimuli is, and then your second kind of way of thinking would be like, how do I connect the two, and how do I respond to the first stimulus?
Okay, very good, good. So can someone in a nutshell describe the actual experiment that she conducted?
So basically they were given like numbers and colors and they were like blue was tied to 8. And then if you were shown blue, you had to remember the number 8.
Yeah, and what did they find in terms of the colors' impact on recall?
Brighter colors are easier to like associate with numbers than duller.
Yeah, so they talk about, like the vivid colors, it was a little bit easier to remember the numbers better than the ones that were more neutral. But what was the biggest condition of remembering, basically?
Frequency of the exposure.
Yeah, so how often you're exposed to the actual card. So all things being equal, if you were exposed the same amount of times to the vivid and the neutral, there would be a slight advantage in terms of the vivid ones, right? In terms of promoting recall. Anything you'd like to add this group?
In the experiments, she did unrelated stimuli, so it wasn't like a pen with paper.
Mhm.
So if you reverse it, so if I want you to give me, if I say pen and the kids will say paper.
Right.
If I say paper, like they should be able to tell me pen. But in her experiments, they were not related, so it was not a causal or.
Yeah.
It was unrelated to strictly test memory. It was not. It was not a testing of association. It was a testing of the memory formed by that association.
Yeah, and pairing two things together. Has anyone heard of the Stroop test? That's pretty famous in psychology. So in the Stroop test, what happens is you have different words that are written down, like let's say blue, green, red, and orange. So those words are written down, but on the Stroop test, you're not asked to read the word, you're asked to say the color that the word is printed in. So like blue might be brown, so you would say brown, and yellow might be green, so you would say green. And we had a day for incoming students, so students who have committed to go to RSU a couple of weeks ago, and one of the things we did as a group of professors is we had the students do the Stroop test, and Dr. Moon led it. I was in the Stroop test as well, and I didn't do nearly as well as the students, but it's tricky. It's very tricky. So I just wanted to mention that STROOP, that's another pretty famous experiment that's kind of somewhat related, I guess. Anything else?
On the site we were looking at, it talks about the modality effects, because Calkins did two sets of experiments. One was visual and the other was auditory.
Okay.
And she noted that both sets were similar, except in the auditory presentation, the recency effects were stronger. So like the more recent the person heard the audio, they were able to associate it better.
Yeah, does that make sense to you? Yeah. And it depends, I think some of us learn better through audio, and so that might actually be easier. But for most of us, we learn a whole lot through reading, right? And so that becomes easier to remember in that manner. All right, thank you for exploring the life of Calkins. Want to say just a few more things about her. So on page 304, at the bottom of the page, they talk about this study. This study was actually like her PhD thesis, all right? And so you can imagine, I mean, this is a groundbreaking study just in and of itself, but for someone to do something like that before they're even really in the profession was amazing. And so the year before, Calkins had requested and been given an unofficial PhD examination. I don't know what an unofficial examination looks like, except it's probably the same examination, it just doesn't count. William James described her performance as much the most brilliant examination for the PhD that we have had at Harvard. That's pretty awesome, and it comes from William James. He's no slacker in this department, right? Münsterberg petitioned the Harvard Corporation to reconsider and admit Calkins to official degree candidacy because they weren't admitting females, okay? So she has people on her side who are there who are saying, look at this female, look at what she's doing. If any female should be admitted, it should be Calkins, right? The corporation promptly refused. Calkins returned to Wellesley, so she's back teaching again, having exceeded the requirements of a Harvard PhD, but without the title. That remained that way for her entire life. That's kind of sad, right? Yeah, I mean, I think it's very sad. In 1902, she was offered a Radcliffe PhD, Radcliffe College having been founded in 1894 as Harvard's corresponding institution for women. So sort of like equivalent, but not really, but equivalent in terms of name and how they presented the school. Calkins declined because Radcliffe was exclusively an undergraduate school. And so back in the day, a lot of schools only granted undergraduate degrees. So this was a school that only granted an undergraduate degree. So she said, why am I going to say I'm receiving a PhD from there when they don't even grant that? And she also said a Radcliffe degree wouldn't reflect the reality of her academic work at Harvard. Since then, there have been people who have wanted to retroactively, have her awarded the PhD, but all to no avail. She still, even posthumously, doesn't have that PhD. So, really interesting lady, and you think about everything she did growing up, and her life sounds like it was small on the outside, right, socially, but very rich in her academic life. So she had this whole really rich academic life to go with those other things. Any questions on Calkins? Okay. We are going to take a break on this chapter and move into behaviorism. We will circle back to the remainder of the chapter when I see you next week on Tuesday, but I do want to jump ahead. And if I didn't ask you last week about what behaviorism is, I'd like to do that today. So I guess I just should have asked you, what is behaviorism? What do you know about that prior to reading chapter 9?
Would you kind of say it's like learning things about people based off their behavior?
Mm-hmm. So behavior indicates what a person's thinking, what they're feeling, what their intellectual capacity is. We're going to find indicators that we can observe that indicate behaviorism of excellent students. Write down what that is, and every time we see that behavior, they get like a little check, and we tally all those up, and then we could rate you excellent student to one that might be able to, pump up their volume a little bit. Okay.
So the behavior itself indicates something. Other things.
Also just kind of like to build off of it, isn't it like how you react to certain like situations to see like how the behavior is, like there's like stressor or something?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you can look at it on that. So we could look at how you perform as a student in different environments. And behaviorists thought that the environment and what was being said to someone, the rewards and punishments that went on, would either cause a behavior to be more prolific. Okay, we want to see in the classroom a certain behavior increase, and we want another to decrease. And so we're going to do that by changing up the environment, by maybe, in grade school, did you do red light, green light, doing something like that? Yeah. So behaviorism is alive and well in the K through 5 setting. And I want you to think back to your own childhood experience in education. What did it look like? What did a day in the life of your first grade self look like? Everyone with me?
Eating candy.
Eating candy? Okay. And did you receive candy for doing something?
Yeah, if I like read books, I would receive candy.
Read book,
Get candy.
get Jolly Rancher. Read 5 books, get either a Jolly Rancher or something, like a cupcake, right? So there was a value, an exchange rate.
The Pizza Hut personal pan pizza.
Oh my gosh, yeah. And that's a meme, too, I think. How many books did you read for the Pizza Hut personal pan pizza? Yeah. Yeah, I know about that. That was back in my day. Other things you remember, candy.
We had a behavior tree, so like if you behaved well, you got a green card at the end of the day, and then if you were bad, you got a red card and a call to your mom. You did not want that.
Behavior tree. Okay, so you got a good card?
Yeah, green card if we were good and quiet and.
Okay, I'm gonna come back to that too, good and quiet. And then a red one?
Yeah, we were like disruptive and, you know.
Ill behaved. And your parents heard about it?
Yeah.
Parents, eek. All right. Other ways behaviorism was alive and well in your first grade classroom, kindergarten classroom, second grade, that time period.
My school had a treasure box.
Oh, yeah, those were great. Did they have good treasures inside?
No.
Yeah, so,
Tokens to get in
okay, so you would get tokens for what kinds of things?
it. There was multiplication and
Okay.
and
Okay, so was it more specific to subjects?
it was just, well, I just remember multiplication.
Okay.
Like math sheets and then ARE.
Oh, they still were doing math sheets. Okay, all right. It's hard for me to hide how I feel about that. So you probably already know though. So tokens, and then you had so many tokens and you would get to go, was it like at the end of the week to the treasure chest? Okay. Do you have any memorable treasures from that time? Because I feel like you probably did pretty well in school.
Well, I don't know.
You don't remember? Yeah. Anything else? Okay, I'll share two quick stories with you. So the first was in second grade, and I had moved, my dad worked for the Army Corps of Engineers, and so we traveled a lot, and so started pre-K in Mississippi, and then moved to Virginia, and then maybe it was third grade, to Oklahoma, all right? And I really enjoyed doing math. And so I love the math sheets, all right, which I think are just kind of a brain dead way to learn math. Like you need creativity, you need all different things to learn math. But I was really good at completing those sheets in a really short amount of time. Okay, so guess what we would get if we completed those like in a certain period of time?
A sticker.
We would get something different than a sticker. So this particular teacher had all these really sugary cereals in her, which I don't know that would even be allowed today, but in her classroom. And she would call up the names. So first of all, she's making an example out of the people who do math fast versus the ones that don't, which not good. And then she's also rewarding speed, maybe. I think it had to be accurate too, but speed is not an indicator of how well you do math, right? And then we would line up like squirrels, so we'd be here. And we would point to the cereal we wanted, and then she would pour it in our hands and we would take it back and we would eat it at our desk. I think without a drink or anything, so I do remember lots of Captain Crunch going down really dry, you know? So that was one example. Another example was how the room was formed, and I think this was in maybe 5th or 6th grade. So there were 24 seats in the classroom, and you were ordered by how good your grades were in class.
That's terrible.
That is so bad.
Yeah, I was a little overachiever as a child, and so I was, as the student who was almost always in first, but at times would slip down to second, I was a nervous wreck all the time at losing my first, but then also lots of people making fun of me for being first. And that was all due to how that teacher chose to set up the classroom. And what do you think about that?
I think that's setting up the kids that aren't doing well for failure.
Mm-hmm. And I think also setting up kids that are on the other side for potential things too, right? Bullying on both ends of the spectrum, so to speak. But yeah, I would just be a nervous wreck every day. You should not be a nervous wreck going to your 5th grade classroom, right? So that was done all year with that teacher. And any other examples you can think of?
It made me think of Class Dojo, where you'd get points for how well you did things and how.
Okay, what is that?
It's like, it was basically a point system.
Okay.
They would pull up and like you could see how many points you had versus everyone else. And I don't remember what we did to get points, but I think it was like how well you did on things, but like how you behaved, and like if you were good that day, then you got bonus points. Or like if you were absent that day, you wouldn't get the points that the rest of the class did because you weren't there.
Okay, all right.
And then once you reached a certain like point, you could like cash them in basically for prizes.
For prizes, okay. So rewards, consequences, things of that nature. That's behaviorism. Now, behaviorism is used very well in applied behavioral analysis, working with people who have autism. It's been found to have great success. Outside of that, I think behaviorism short-term can work, long-term, you forget some of the things you were even rewarded for doing, right? So long-term, probably not as much. And at least the behaviorist practices of my elementary teachers promoted rote learning versus a deep understanding of the material, right? And performance, grades versus the process of learning, right? So that's, I don't know, it's a little troubling, right? But that was the history I came into high school with. So, and it sounds like it was similar. The other thing I'm going to talk about really quickly is you're good and quiet. Why do you have to be quiet? Some of it's just the teacher's raw nerves, right? And this is not necessarily, do we necessarily want people to grow up well-behaved and quiet and only talk when their hands are raised and be completely compliant? We shouldn't, right? And research shows, and this was more true decades ago. Again, I'm 52, so you have to bear with me as we go back to the late 70s and early 80s, a time of great fashion in my humble opinion, but a weird fashion. And look at, and I just lost my train of thought. Oh, look at how teachers responded to disruptive behaviors in girls versus boys. Girls could not get away with answering a question without raising their hand first. Boys, there'd be like maybe, oh, Johnny, make sure you raise your hand, would be able to do that. And it was very much, I felt like training us to be compliant to a certain extent. And that's a little bit off topic, but sort of related, so. Yeah, all right. So, and behaviorism isn't all bad. A lot of behaviorism comes as a result of what people learned studying and doing research on animals. So it's tied to evolutionary psychology and this interest on what animals do and how we might apply some of those principles to human beings, all right? Okay, we may not get through this entire video, but we are going to end with it today, and then look for a follow-up announcement from me around Thursday about what I need you to do for points for class, and then I will see you in person next Tuesday. So this is the last thing that we have, I think, to do.
And please take notes.
At Cellular, you don't have to choose between a great deal on the phone you want and the phone plan that's right for you.
Oh, whoops, that's my sports psychology class. I'm so sorry. Embracing imperfection in sport recovery. That's not what I want. It's interesting. This is what I want. This is where I'm glad I wrote the title and didn't just put the link in. And you recognize him, we've heard from him once already.
I thought life was gonna slow down. Boy, was I wrong.
According to Watson, behavior with human. Two behaviorists named Fred and John meet at a party. Fred says to John, "You're fine. How am I?" Now, that was a joke. And if you didn't quite get that joke, It's probably because you need to learn more about behaviorism. So I'll go ahead and give you that joke again at the end of this video after we've talked a little bit more about what behaviorism is. Now, what I'll do is I'll talk about 4 main contributors to behaviorism in the past century. But before I do that, let's go ahead and talk about 5 main ideas behind behaviorism. Number 1 is that the study of behavior should be a natural science, and thus it should use the scientific method to study behavior. Number 2 is that behavior is shaped by its consequences, which would include rewards and punishments. Number 3, mental processes such as thoughts and feelings can never be directly observable and therefore should be excluded in trying to understand behavior. Number 4, that in order to understand learning, we need to understand both operant and classical conditioning. And number 5, because the environment plays a major role in the shaping of behavior, if we want to have prediction and control of behavior, we'll then need to manipulate the environment. So how did behaviorism come about? Well, towards the end of the 19th century, one of the things that was really fascinating to people in Europe and in North America was the behavior of animals, cats and dogs and other animals that they might come in contact with. And there was just this flurry of interest in the natural abilities of cats and dogs and how intelligent they were and so on. And people would send in anecdotes to magazines and other places talking about the special feat of their horse, their cat, their dog, whatever it was. And then other people would try to make sense of it. And comparative psychology grew up around this time, where professors in different universities started to collect those anecdotes and then write books about what we knew about the intelligence of different kinds of animals. But that all changed around 1900 when comparative psychologists started moving away from just using anecdotes and looking at behavior in the laboratory. One of the first people to do this was Edward Lee Thorndike. Thorndike was an American who studied learning in chickens while he was working on his dissertation at Harvard University. He later moved to Columbia to finish his dissertation, and he added cats to the mix. So for instance, with the cats, what he would do is make puzzle boxes for the cat, where he put a cat inside the box, and the cat had to figure out how to escape the box. And he could do this perhaps in one puzzle box by pulling on a string and pushing a lever and putting its paw through some little hole. And so eventually the cats would learn how to get out of those puzzle boxes. And what Thorndike observed about both his chickens and his cats was that learning took place through trial and error, and that he soon realized that pretty much all animals learn through trial and error rather than some sort of innate intelligence or some sort of consciousness. As a result of these sort of systematic observations that he was making of his cats and chickens, he proposed 2 laws of learning. The first one was the law of effect. And the law of effect has to do with the relationship between the stimulus and the response and what happens afterwards. So here we have the stimulus, and it could be, for instance, a lever or a string hanging inside the puzzle box. And then the response would be what the animal does in response to that stimulus. So perhaps the cat puts its paw up on the lever, and by putting the paw on the lever, it causes the lever to open up the door and the cat can escape. So what immediately would happen afterwards is something satisfying. It would be called a satisfier because you, the cat, would feel good after it had performed this particular response to the stimulus. And that means that the next time that the cat was in that box and saw that same lever, it'd probably be more likely then to also again use its paw on that lever and open up the box. So satisfiers increase our tendency to want to make the same response to the stimulus. Contrary to that would be annoyers, is what Thorndike called them, which would mean that you've gone ahead and performed this response, but something annoying happened where afterwards as a consequence. So for example, maybe the cat sees the lever, but this time it brushed its tail against the lever and nothing happened. And so therefore the cat is frustrated, it's still stuck inside this box, it's annoying. So the next time it sees this lever, it's going to be less likely to brush its tail against the lever. Now, of course, the number of times that you have these experiences is going to also strengthen or weaken the response. And so the second law that he proposed was called the law of exercise, which basically said the more trials you have of learning, the stronger you're going to learn this particular response. So if you've had several times where you saw the stimulus, then there was the response, and it was followed by a satisfier, and you've done that many times over many trials, you're going to get really good at it. It's going to be a really strong connection between the S and the R. Likewise, if you've had many occasions to go ahead and have the response to the stimulus followed by the annoyer is going to also strengthen the fact that you're probably not going to be making that response then to the stimulus. Or I should say, it really weakens it greatly, even more so, because you've had so many times to practice making this bad response that led you to have this annoying consequence. So those are the two main things that Thorndike proposed and then contributed to the learning of animals. And you can see this is a marked difference from what was going on before that, where people were just focused really on these anecdotes about the abilities of their animals. Now Thorndike has introduced a way that you can systematically study behavior of animals in the laboratory.
This is Wix Studio, the platform for agencies and enterprises, built to meet any brief.
And that leads us to our second main contributor to behaviorism, and that's Ivan Pavlov. Pavlov was a Russian physiologist who was originally born to a family of 11 children, and his parents were both peasants who worked on the fields, and they didn't own the land. His father was the village priest, his mother was the daughter of a village priest, and it was expected that Ivan would go off to seminary and become a priest himself. So he goes off to seminary school to become a priest, but while he's there, he comes across many scientific works, including Darwin's Origin of Species. And this ignited his interest in science even more, and he eventually dropped out of seminary and was able to secure a fellowship to attend St. Petersburg University as a medical student. Now, this took him several years to work on this fellowship and to continue to do his studies. In order to support himself, he had to take on different research assistantships and even became the director of a laboratory while he was still an undergraduate. Eventually, he was offered his own laboratory as a professor at the St. Petersburg Military and Medical Academy. And what was he working on? Well, what he had chosen to start working on years before was the digestive tract. And now that he had his own laboratory, he completely spent all of his time on digestion. And it's this work that he did on digestion that led him to win the Nobel Prize in Physiology in 1904. What he did in physiology is that he would work with dogs, creating little fistulas along the digestive tract. And so a fistula is like a little surgical opening that he could then insert like a little tube in there and collect some juices or whatever the things were that were happening at digestion at that particular point. And he did this so expertly that his dogs could live for many, many years and not suffer any infections or whatever. And he became quite successful at then studying digestion using this method of fistulas. While he was doing this work, he also came upon this phenomenon that he originally called psychic secretions. What he discovered was that dogs could be trained to associate a neutral stimulus, such as the sound of a bell, with the presentation of food. This would cause the dogs to salivate in response to the sound of the bell, even if no food was present. This groundbreaking work in classical conditioning is really, really important, and we still talk about it today in many different ways. Pavlov's work then has not only had a significant impact on psychology, it's also impacted physiology, medicine, and other sciences. And this work on classical conditioning has lots of applications to education and even therapy. Person number 3 is John Watson. John Watson was also an American psychologist who received his PhD at the University of Chicago in 1903. Watson is best known for his influential 1913 paper, Psychology as the Behaviorist Views It, in which he outlined his views of behaviorism in sort of like a manifesto. According to Watson, behaviorism is the study of observable behavior rather than internal mental states. And this would be the way we should understand then and explain human behavior. He believed that behavior could be predicted and controlled through the manipulation of external stimuli, and that the study of psychology then should be focused on observable behaviors